All right, welcome. I hope everybody is doing well today. We are going to be talking about emerging viral diseases here in chapter 16. And I've got the lecture split into two parts, and there'll be two corresponding videos. So in the first half today, we'll talk about factors that influence the emergence of viral infections. And those could be human factors, environmental factors, or viral factors. And then in the second half, we'll dive into some notable emerging or re-emerging viral diseases, although we will actually hit up a few in the first half as well. So just to give you a feeling for what some of those diseases are. Of course, the big one that's on everybody's mind right now is coronavirus. COVID-19 would definitely count as an emerging disease. But just generally speaking, any of these emerging diseases would be defined as a pathogen that's not been seen in a particular location or in a particular population, i.e. the human population before. So it's something new. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's new in terms of being new to nature, new to planet Earth, but it's new to medicine, right? May have been a virus that's been around for a long time, just hasn't caused disease in humans before. So one local example that's kind of unique is this bourbon virus, which is a virus that was discovered in Bourbon County, Kansas. And if you're not from this area, Bourbon County is the county just to the north of us. We're in Crawford County. Here, Bourbon County houses Fort Scott. So if you go from Pittsburg to Kansas City, you're up 69. You're driving through Bourbon County. But anyway, this was a new tick-borne disease that was discovered after a man in Fort Scott area died from this kind of mysterious infection, and they were able to identify this new virus. And in fact, we even had CDC on campus here for a number of days. This was several years ago now, doing some local investigations into this particular virus. So we have emerging diseases, EIDs, then we also have re-emerging diseases, and these would basically be viruses that had already previously emerged, then been controlled, but are now reappearing, right? We're getting a recurrent spike in infections. And a lot of these emerging and re-emerging diseases tend to be viruses. So, they could be parasites or bacteria, but typically these, if you hear those terms, usually referring to viral diseases. And so we'll go into some of the factors that can influence emergence or reemergence, but I did just want to point out up front that a very high percentage, about 3/4 of these emerging or re-emerging infections would be considered zoonoses, right, which are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. And that could come from wildlife, from domestic animals, or many times could be vectored through mosquitoes or ticks typically. All right, so we really have these three main categories of factors that have been well studied in terms of their influence on emerging and re-emerging diseases. And these are human factors, environmental factors, and then the viral factors. So we'll kind of go through each of these. So in the human factor category, we have a number of, I guess you call them sub-factors, include urbanization, globalization, sociological factors, human behavior, and then also the susceptibility of the human host. I'll touch just briefly on each of these. So of course, that term urbanization, right, refers to people living together in towns or cities as opposed to in rural areas. And in urban areas, you tend to have denser populations, right, which helps facilitate spread of viral diseases. You may have overcrowding. Depending on the particular urban area you're talking about, there might not be adequate sanitation or clean water. So all of those things could certainly contribute to the spread of viruses that might affect humans. Um, Globalization, of course, could be related to urbanization, but that term really refers to expansion of economies and populations throughout the entire world. And of course, we see ongoing globalization happening and has been happening for a long time. Um, and so just that spread of people around the world, right, and economies around the world is going to carry diseases with them. So, people traveling now very, very quickly and easily by airplane can take a virus around the world in a matter of hours. And just a couple of kind of more recent examples of this would be the original SARS um, outbreak in 2003 and a West Nile virus outbreak in the late 90s in New York City in particular I'm going to focus on, but I'll give you just a little bit more detail on those two outbreaks that are really attributed to globalization. So, of course, the original SARS, SARS-1, appeared in 2003 in China, um, and it very quickly got spread all over the world by people traveling from China to Europe to North America. So we ended up with about 8,000 people being infected, and about 10% of those individuals died. Um, this was really our first exposure to a serious coronavirus. Um, but this was originally believed to have been passage. I spoke about zoonoses, passage from these animals called palm civets, which are mammals, sort of cat-like-ish in appearance, that were sold for meat in China. So you had people becoming infected either from interacting with the live animals or with the, the dead animal potentially being sold in a meat market in China. And then in terms of the West Nile outbreak, and this was late 90s, so West Nile has been around for a while. It's a mosquito-borne virus first identified in Africa in the 30s, pretty prevalent in certain parts of the world where mosquito-borne diseases tend to be a bigger problem. Most people infected with West Nile tend to be asymptomatic. You can get some sort of typical viral symptoms, but some relatively low percentage of infections tend to be much more serious, resulting in encephalitis or meningitis. That's where you tend to get most of your fatalities. But we saw this emergence in North America in 1999, so this was in October. We saw both birds and humans being affected, so birds can be killed by West Nile as well. We saw huge numbers of crows dying in a relatively short time span. And we believe West Nile got to New York from other parts of the world by either being imported with birds or with mosquitoes that were stowing away on cargo ships or international flights. And we ended up with a significant number of human cases in the U.S., over 40,000, and over 1,500 deaths over a number of years. So again, globalization was a contributing factor in both of these outbreaks, right? SARS, you had people traveling all over, taking the virus with them. In West Nile, you had people unintentionally transporting mosquitoes or birds carrying the virus with them around the world. And if you're not familiar with West Nile, I just want to point out, so it can cycle between this collect species of mosquito shown here and birds. Mosquitoes can also transmit to, of course, to humans, also to horses. Humans are typically thought of as a dead-end host, meaning you can't usually get human-to-human transmission of West Nile. Really only two exceptions to that. One would be mother to child, either during birth or potentially even through breastfed milk, or through an organ transplant or a blood transfusion, although we are now testing the blood supply for West Nile virus. So it's very unlikely you would get it from a blood transfusion. So some of the other human factors include sociological factors. This could be all kinds of stuff, but it could be a lack of public health infrastructures, could be decay of existing infrastructures due to conflicts such as wars, lack of access to vaccinations, or reduced vaccination rates. I'll come back to that in a minute. Human behaviors could be a contributing factor, right? So what do you eat? Where do you eat? Um, Sexual activity, drug use, religious practices, all of those things might influence viral spread. And then you've got susceptibility of the human host. And, really here we're talking about viruses that are capable of infecting humans. So when we say susceptibility, we're talking about things that might alter susceptibility or enhance susceptibility. So if people are becoming immunocompromised, pregnant women, or people that are malnourished, or the very, very old or very young tend to be more susceptible. So anytime you see shifts in the numbers of individuals that fall into any of those groups, you could see more virus spread. But let me come back to this idea of reduced vaccination and tie this in, so the sociological factor in with reemergence of a viral disease. So measles could very well be considered a reemerging disease. I think it's fair to say that it does fall into that category now. So luckily measles is something most of us aren't familiar with because it has essentially been eradicated in North America for quite a few years, but it's a respiratory virus, causes very high fever, up to 105. You get a rash over the entire body. You can see in this child here, you can see the rash on their cheeks. Extremely contagious. You get very, very sick for about a week, and there can be some very serious complications, a lot of which are tied in with that very high fever. So deafness, blindness, seizures, and that's not a super high death rate. People do die of measles. And so measles has continued to be a problem globally. So you have about 20 million people a year infected with measles, and over 140,000 deaths every year, and it is still one of the leading causes of death in very young children because they're more prone to some of the more serious side effects from measles. So it's not a newly emerging disease, but as I said, it may be considered re-emerging, at least in the United States. So it is still endemic in parts of Europe and Africa. But in the U.S. specifically, before the measles vaccination program began in the early 60s, there were a significant number of hospitalizations every year due to measles. And, not a huge number of deaths, but, hundreds of individuals were dying every year from measles. And so you can see here on this graph, this is U.S. data, right? Thousands of cases over time. And you can see in the 1950s and 1960s, right, pretty significant number of measles cases. Vaccine introduced here in the early 60s, and we saw this rapid drop-off in the number of cases, kind of bounced up and down for a while, but was declared officially eliminated in the U.S. in 2000. But now, of course, we're seeing this comeback of measles due to the rise of the anti-vax movement and reduced numbers of infants receiving their MMR, their measles, mumps, rubella combo vaccine. So we're starting to see cases pop up. So 2014, we had over 600 cases in the U.S. 2015, there was this famous outbreak that was tied in with two of the Disney theme parks in California. So if you look at the numbers down here, again, this is U.S. data. I think it's safe to say that definitely does seem to be a re-emerging disease, unfortunately, one that we had effectively eradicated. All right, so we went through this list of human factors. Let's talk briefly about some environmental or ecological factors that may influence viral emergence. And some of these are going to be consequences of those human factors we already talked about: urbanization, globalization, right? Basically, people encroaching into ecological areas that humans had previously not occupied, right? And in particular, that increases this risk of these zoonotic transfer to humans, right? You're coming in contact with animals that you hadn't previously been in contact with. And we can think of indirect or direct influences. Indirect would be something like this Nipah virus outbreak in Malaysia in the late 90s. We had almost 300 cases. And this was said to be indirect because the primary carrier of this virus were bats who were asymptomatic. They are thought to have transferred it to pigs, and then, of course, people came in contact with the pigs because they were farming the pigs or worked in slaughterhouses and were handling the animals in that way. But again, these pigs would not have been in contact with these local bats if it had not been for sort of this increased globalization, right, encroachment into new habitats. Or you've got like a direct example here, which would be Nipah virus cases in the early 2000s, going directly from bats to humans from that primary source. This was in Bangladesh. In this particular case, I believe locals were collecting it was like palm sap from palm trees, and I think they basically do that just by putting containers or buckets under the tree, and they essentially drill a hole, almost like you would with collecting maple syrup or something like that. And so these bats were coming and feeding on the sap that was being collected, and then of course humans were ingesting the sap or using it. And getting sick directly from the bats. We could have weather, climate change, right? Could be ecological factor that may influence virus spread. So this could be, short-term, just seasonal changes, short-term weather patterns, or it could be these longer climate trends, which of course now the primary concern is global warming. So just to give you an example of like a seasonal change in the early 90s, the Four Corners region in southwest U.S., so this was like Utah, Arizona, etc., had very heavy rains, much heavier than normal due to it being an El Nino year. And so this caused more vegetation and allowed the population of deer mice to increase very dramatically, about tenfold. And if you're not familiar with the Sin Nombre virus, this is a hantavirus. These are very scary, very deadly viruses, very high mortality rate, usually up in the 60-70% range. But people will contract this virus, so it's carried by the mice, and then it can get passed off in their feces or urine. So if you have mice either in your house or in a barn, or really if you come into contact with those mouse droppings either directly or through aerosolized particles, you can become sick with this virus. So a relatively small number of people infected, but this was an unusually large number of people in a particular year to have this hantavirus infection, and it's attributed directly to the increase in the mice population, which is attributed directly to the change in the weather for that particular season. And then if you think of this in terms of some of these larger global trends, right, we're seeing increase in global temperatures, which can allow things like increased rainfall. You get more stagnant water sitting around. You get larger mosquito populations, and of course mosquitoes are vectors for many viral diseases. Ticks expanding their range due to increased temperature. So these climate changes can have very dire consequences in terms of viral spread. One I didn't mention is even migratory birds, right, changing their migration routes due to climate change. And of course, birds can carry a number of diseases, some of the bird flus, West Nile. And then the last group I wanted to mention here are the viral factors themselves that could influence emergence. And really what we're talking about here are genetic changes in the virus, right? So maybe we had a virus that either wasn't very infectious in humans, so it had not emerged in the human population, or maybe it was one that we had controlled through vaccination or herd immunity that is now reemerging because of some genetic changes. So we get these basically increased virulence of a virus or infectivity of a virus due to these genetic alterations. And we've talked about these types of changes before. So these would be like reassortment, um, basically occurring in any kind of segmented viruses like influenza, recombination, which is you could have we've seen that in HIV and herpes viruses, or just mutation that you get pretty rapidly in all RNA viruses. So anyway, I will stop there and we'll continue in part 2.